Hey, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and it is the Property Podcast. And this week, yes, we're talking Brexit. Brexit is one subject that everyone seems to have an opinion on. And this week, we've got opinions from multiple investors.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning investors just like you come together to be informed and inspired. You're probably hearing a lot in the media at the moment and wondering what you should be doing about your own investments and wondering what other investors are up to and what they're thinking about everything that's going on. Well, wonder no more, because we've got three hubbers on the show today talking about exactly what they're thinking and doing.
So this week, we've not got one, we've got two news stories for you. Double dose, so enjoy this. First up, Rob, it's bad news for one of landlords' most hated policies.
Yeah, which means good news for landlords potentially, and good news for those of us who like to see the government brought down a peg or two every so often. So the government was taken to the High Court over the right to rent check. So this is the check that you have to do every time you let a property to make sure that the person living there is allowed to be in the UK. Because obviously, as a landlord, you should be involved in border security. Makes total sense. Well, no, actually, as it turns out, it doesn't. Because this policy has been found to be discriminatory and a breach of human rights laws by the High Court. The judge said that the scheme had little or no effect in its main aim of controlling immigration, and even if it did have any effect, it was significantly outweighed by the discriminatory effect. And he's basically saying that the scheme forces landlords to discriminate against people on the basis of their nationality and ethnicity because they're scared of the fines or the potential prison sentence they'll get if they don't follow the very complicated checks that you're supposed to make. And I think he's absolutely spot on. The policy is asking landlords to do something that they shouldn't be doing and they're not qualified to do. And I'm absolutely convinced that it does lead to discrimination and potentially giving a hard time to people who the least need to be given a hard time. So bad news for the government on this one. And to be honest, I think it serves them right because they trialled this policy. They did a pilot scheme in the West Midlands and then they rolled it out nationwide before actually looking at the results of the pilot study. So they've gone ahead, done whatever they wanted to do, and now it's possibly coming back to bite them. That doesn't mean that this policy has gone away completely. They've got the right to appeal, and that's what they're going to do. So it may be that the policy stays in place. It might be that it gets tweaked. It might be that it gets abolished entirely. So for the time being, you need to be doing those checks. But watch this space because that might be changing. Something that's not going to be changing, Rob, is journalists' love of big, impressive sounding headlines that possibly don't turn out to be a match with reality. You've got a good example of one of those right now.
Yeah, and perfectly timed for this week's episode. So the headline reads, and this is on the BBC's website, struggling towns to get 1.6 billion post-Brexit boost. Woohoo! Everyone is in the money. But are they? Because actually, the article tries to talk about how this is a bribe for different areas to get them behind Theresa May and her policies. But if this is a bribe, then I think Theresa May needs to go to bribe school. Because when you break this down, it's actually quite pitiful. And although the headline sounds wonderful, the impact this money will have, I imagine, will be very limited. Now, that's for a couple of reasons. One, local authorities aren't known for their wise spending of budgets. That's a little harsh because there are some good areas. You know, Manchester has been very impressive of how they've transformed that city with investment. But the generalisation, I think, is reasonably fair. There's been a lot of wasted money over the years. But the other reason, and most importantly, is actually the amount of money. Because of the £1.6 billion that's been allocated, 600 million has already been designated to different areas. And I'll give you a flavour of the breakdown. I won't run through them all. But northwest of England, that's a pretty big area, 281 million. The northeast of England, another massive area, 105 million. And it goes on from there. Now, they may sound like big pots of money. 281 million for the northwest, which was the biggest sum, by the way. It's not a lot at all. In Manchester alone, which is just one part of the northwest, and the northwest is a very big place, but in Manchester alone, there are multiple schemes that pound notes-wise are significantly bigger than that 281 million. For example, there's a development scheme that Property Hub Invest have worked on in Manchester, just one development scheme in Deansgate, that is more than that whole pot for the whole of the northwest. So 1.6 billion sounds impressive. 281 million sounds okay, but when you realise it's got to be spread across such a huge region, it means they'll be lucky to fill in a few potholes by the end of it. And it gets worse, because that is obviously the biggest sum. Northeast of England, 105 million. What are they going to do with that? And there's some areas like the east of England that are going to get 25 million. Again, tarmacking a few roads, it's just not going to have the impact. It smacks of laziness for me, this policy, because it's just a load of money being thrown in to try and sound good. So Theresa May can say how much money that has been put into these regions, but without being strategic and saying, right, this money is going to go to these projects which will have this positive effect. I think the money will be wasted, and the money that they've got isn't enough in the first place either. So I wish this was a little bit more thought through, but as most things that seem to come out of Westminster, it isn't. So unfortunately, the impact that this 1.6 billion should have will probably end up being minimal.
So, Brexit. If you're anything like me, you're probably simultaneously absolutely sick to death of this topic, but also aware that it's one of the biggest national talking points for a reason, and you're wondering how you should invest and what you should be doing as a result of it. And it's hard to know what to do as a result of it, because the likely result seems to change from day to day. We've got a lot of thoughts on this topic. We've got lots of thoughts on the politics of it, which we're largely going to stay away from. But we've got some far more helpful thoughts about what this means for your investments and what actions you should be taking now to capitalise on the current situation. We're going to be talking about those next week, and we're going to be pretty forthright, I think it's fair to say. But our views, although we might not always remember this, aren't that important. What's important are the views of the people who are actually out there buying and selling, or not, all the individuals who make up the property market, because it's what all of those people are doing and thinking that's going to determine what actually happens. So what is actually going on in the property market? Well, today we're going to be hearing from three of the hubbers who we've been following on their journeys. We'll hear from Sarah, Iain and Steve, and hear about what their thoughts are around Brexit and how, if at all, they've changed their approach based on what's going on politically.
So first up today, we've got Sarah back on. She's based in Teddington, southwest London, and Sarah's doing refurbs in Sheffield and flipping properties. So let's see what she's got to say about Brexit.
Yeah, I hate the B word. It is the bane of my life. But, I mean, it's just that whole uncertainty. However, having said that, what I have noticed, because my flips are in Sheffield, what I've noticed is that the market's still moving up there, but in certain spaces. So anything that's a renovation project, which is what I'm always looking for, they are flying off the shelf. The other end of the market, I think, is, we'll see, because I'm going to be at the other end of the market, which is what I'm slightly nervous about, is the finished product that's done to a high standard that is kind of for the aspirational purchaser. So somebody who wants, you know, a lovely, lovely property in a nice area. I'm hoping, and from what I can hear from the agents, is that those ones are moving fast as well. But it seems to be that glut in the middle of the market where they're properties that have been lived in. They are slightly tired, but not enough margin for someone to do as a flip. And as a purchaser, you know you're going to spend a bit of money in there. They seem to be taking a little bit longer on the market, and I'm seeing reductions in the market coming through quite a lot on those kind of properties.
So I think the first thing to say about Sarah is she's operating in a market that Rob and I are quite fond of at the moment, so based on where it is in the cycle. It's not getting the headlines, but that's okay. It's a place that we feel will get the headlines. So a relatively safe bet. It's not falling. It's not really increasing at any great rate of knots, but it's got huge potential to do so in the future. Now, because Sarah operates in flips, though, this is where she may struggle, because flips in a market that isn't buoyant, it's just harder work. You haven't got that buffer, that forgiveness that a rising market gives you. And it gives you in two forms. One, the fact that your property prices are increasing. So if you are out with your numbers a little bit, the market will hopefully carry on rising and protect you that way. But secondly, because the market's rising, it's a more active market, and there are more people in that market looking to buy. Now, Sarah touches on the marketplaces she operates in, and I actually have a slightly different view to this. We could simplify the market by saying you've got the bottom of the market, the middle of the market, and the top of the market. So the bottom of the market is the lower price properties in sometimes areas that are described as not so desirable. You've got the top end of the market, which is the real high-end, super prestigious stuff, and at price points that just most people will never get to. And then you've got the biggest chunk, which is the middle of the market. And I think this is where, as buy-to-let investors, the majority of us should play. Now, there are going to be people who have niche strategies and that may work for them, but the middle of the market is where most people will stay through most cycles. Because in any recession or any downturn in the market, the bottom end of the market, they're already struggling in the first place. So any more pressure on them is going to just make it harder for them to meet their bills and pay their rent, which for landlords puts you in a tricky position. And if you're flipping to that market, also means that people can't really buy if that takes place as well. The top end of the market, well, in the good times, there's more people in that top end. But in the not so good times, there's less people there. They move back down into the middle. And that means that you may struggle with that market in a downturn as well. And we've seen a great example of this when we look at the London prime property market over the last 2 years. Has probably been the worst performing market in the UK because the Brexit uncertainty has meant that the ultra rich aren't buying in as much as they used to be, or maybe there's less of the ultra rich as well. And that market has really suffered as a consequence. So the middle of the market is actually the safer place to play. Even if the margins aren't there right now, maybe that means that Sheffield as an area for flips isn't the place. But what Sarah should find is there's more people willing to buy in that market. The Brexit lesson I take from this is be very thoughtful about where you're operating, what market you're playing in. And is that the right market for me, for the level of risk I'm willing to tolerate?
Yeah, flipping's a funny one as a model because you kind of want the market to be doing really badly when you buy because you want to be getting it at a discount at the best price you possibly can, and you want there to be a ready market for what you're selling. If you had to have it one way round, I guess you'd want to have a buoyant market because it's that sale at the end that's so important, and if you've got lots of buyers, they could bid each other up and get you the best possible price. It is kind of possible to have both at once because they're two different markets. One is developers and the other is owner-occupiers. So it's possible, if not very likely, that you could have developers who are not very keen, not doing very much, and lots of owner-occupiers who really want to have your really nicely done-up house at the end. If anything, though, it feels like it's more like the reverse of that. That's something that will come up as we hear from Iain. Iain is in the southeast. He's been doing all sorts of developments in the past, but more recently he's been setting his sights on trying to build up a long-term buy-to-let portfolio. So what's he been seeing in the market?
Well, I think it's a great time to be buying because if people are sitting there not knowing which way things are going to go, and I am of the slightly more optimistic attitude that as soon as everyone knows what's going on one way or another, the world will settle down again. I'm going to make hay while the sun shines and hope it then continues to shine.
So Ian's feeling pretty optimistic, but with all the doom and gloom headlines, surely he's the only one out there trying to invest.
Oh, crikey, the competition's terrifying. I put in a bid 30,000 over the asking price on a corner plot with the potential to extend. No planning permission, just the potential. And was outbid by, I think, 40, 50 grand in the end. So, that went for 80, 90,000 over the asking price just because it had a corner plot that was potentially available for development.
So the world isn't ending. Who knew? And Iain has a fantastic insight on why this may be the case.
Well, no, I think your average punter buying a house for themselves might be being a bit cautious. But I don't see any slowdown in the developers, the builders, anyone with a business interest in property. I don't see any slowdown at all.
I think that's a really interesting perspective. And this reflects that idea we mentioned earlier about there being separate markets. It seems like people who are into property as a business and are very knowledgeable about it are just cracking on. It's the owner-occupiers who are more likely to get jittery as a result of the headlines. This isn't just one of the 5 transactions that they're making this year. This is their single biggest asset. It's one of the only moves they'll ever make. And it's a really big deal for them. So it's natural that they're going to be more nervous and they're going to wait and see how things pan out. Whereas the professionals are happily cracking on. The fact that they are maybe tells you something about what the market's really like at the moment, and we'll be talking about that a lot more next week.
So next up, we're going to hear from Steve. Steve's been proudly working on vanilla buy-to-lets over the past 5 years or so. He's been picking up 1 and 2 bed flats on the Kent coast. And Steve is very much a research-based investor, so surely he's seen the effects.
The Brexit effect hasn't really had too much of an impact on me so far. I kind of presume that in the shorter term, with all this uncertainty, that if you have got money in the bank for a deposit, now's a good time to go. So I'm kind of not regretting, but I bought my last place 6 months or so ago, and I'm not ready yet. But leading on from that, I suppose the only advice I could give is that now does seem like a good time to buy this window of the next few months. And if you have got a deposit ready to go, perhaps now's the time. And if you negotiate well, you could get a good deal.
So Brexit hasn't stopped Steve either. He bought 6 months ago, and he wishes he'd held on for longer to get an even bigger dip. But I wouldn't worry if I was Steve. Timing the market is a very, very difficult thing to do. Rob and I talk about market cycles a lot, but to try and pinpoint to exactly where we are right now is near on impossible. When is the best time to buy? Well, it's nearly always now. You can look back and find a better time that you should have bought, and you can go into the future and go, right, now was the day. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, Steve's investment in 10 years' time, whether he bought today or 6 months ago, probably won't look that different. So while it may feel that you've got to time the market right and you've got to pick the exact right moment, I wouldn't put that pressure on yourself if that's you right now. In the long term, it evens out, and the difference it makes over the long term is minimal. So Rob, there we have it. We've got those wonderful hubbers back on who've been updating us with their journey, but Brexit hasn't stopped them, and I don't think they're alone. It's not like everybody is switched off, because the market is still very much active.
Absolutely. There are people out there doing deals and moving forward. There's lots of headlines around about how the market has slowed down, and it absolutely has. But it hasn't come to a stop. There are fewer transactions, but there are still transactions. What I think is interesting, as we've explored a little bit throughout this episode, is the types of people who are doing the deals and the types of people who are sitting on the sidelines. Everyone we've heard from seems to believe that there's a buying opportunity at the moment. But if all you did was read the headlines, you'd think the exact opposite. You'd think you'd be crazy to be buying at the moment. And who knows, maybe for once the papers have got it right and the investors have got it wrong. But in general, I think that this is where the money's made. It's by knowing the cycles, understanding how the economy works, and making decisions based on that, not based on whatever you happen to have read over your breakfast that morning. So that's what our hubbers think. What about us? We've done quite a good job, I think, of holding back our own opinions today, but we're going to let ourselves loose next week. Next week, our thoughts on Brexit. What's going to happen depending on how things pan out? What should we be prepared for in the future? And what should you be doing about it right now? We're going to be sharing our views on all of that next week.
So it's that time of the week where we acknowledge some awesome hubbers who've left us a review. So thank you so much to the following. First up, we got Bournemouth Sam. Bournemouth Sam says, I've listened to dozens of podcasts and this is definitely my favourite. Over the last year, I've listened to every episode and some even multiple times. Robs know what they're talking about and give an engaging and entertaining podcast. This podcast helped me make my first buy-to-let purchase recently using Property Hub Invest. Brackets, who are excellent also. And I'm currently planning out my future strategy. Keep up the excellent work, Rob and Rob. And to wrap up this week's reviews, we've got one in from Lee who says, you two guys have given me the right support I need at this stage in my property business. I'm overseas, so there's some disadvantages to a property business, but I'm confident that after receiving great advice through your podcast and others, I'm sure I will make the right investment decisions. Well done. Keep it going. We certainly will. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Lee. And thank you to everyone else who continues to support the podcast and tell people about it as well. That also is very cool. So this week's Hub Extra comes from Rob D. Now, I've used this app on my phone, but Rob, you've been using it a different way. First of all, tell everyone what it is and what it's for.
Yeah, so this is a browser called Brave. So chances are you use either Chrome or Firefox or Safari, or maybe if you're still in the dark ages, you use Internet Explorer for your web browsing. But as you browse around, you probably find that your experience is interrupted by ads and pop-ups and things like that. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we talked about an ad blocker for iPhone. What Brave does is it has ad blocking and tracking protection built into the browser. What that means for you is everything. The whole internet is so much faster. The difference is unbelievable. Everything loads so much faster because it's not loading the ads at all. Now, I've used it on my phone for a while, and that's pretty cool, but I'd never used it on my desktop because I was tied to Chrome because of all the extensions. We talk about Chrome extensions quite a lot. There's loads of really handy little plugins. But here's the killer. With Brave, you can now use Chrome extensions. So there's absolutely no reason not to. You get to use all the same stuff that you enjoyed using before, and everything's faster, and you don't get stupid ads thrown in your face. So I've made the switch a couple of months ago and not looked back. It might take you half an hour to get used to it and reinstall everything you used before, but you'll be saving these seconds here or there, and it really adds up, and it gives you a nicer browsing experience. So if you spend a lot of time using the internet, as I'm pretty sure most of us do, I'd say it's well worth installing.
So that's it. Brexit done. Got a little bit excited in a news story talking about Brexit, but next week we're going to turn the heat up a few more notches. We're going to give you our opinions, so make sure you join us for that. You do not want to miss next week. And before that happens, you've got a lovely dose of Ask Rob and Rob falling into your podcast feed on Tuesday morning. But if you still need more, remember you can get to us via all our social channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. If you're on your phone now, why not follow us and get in touch at Property Hub UK. That's at Property Hub UK. Go along to your favourite social platform and say hello. So while Rob and I go away to prepare to get a bit ranty for next week, we'll leave you with all those wonderful resources to keep you busy. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.